Alrighty, I will start. I hope you all had a wonderful break, a wonderful holiday. Whether you celebrated Thanksgiving or not, I hope you enjoyed the time off. I certainly did. It's good to see you all again. Two things I want to bring to your attention. Number one, remember our last quiz, quiz number 5, will be available tomorrow, Friday, and you will have the week until the next Friday to get it done. And the answers, because I want you to be able to study for the final exam, I believe the answers will be available, I think 3 a.m. Saturday morning. So you won't have to wait several days. They'll be available within a few hours after you take the test. That's that. Also, the extra credit paper is due December 5th. If you want to do it, it's completely optional. Does not hurt your grade, but it can help your grade if you want or need help. So it's there. And I did post the topic for the paper. It's on Blackboard. It's been on Blackboard, so take a look there for the topic. Can I remember what the topic is off the top of my head? I think I asked you to give me ideas about how religion could be less violent, how you could mitigate or de-escalate violence in a religious situation. Yeah, that's what I ask in different words, but that's what I'm asking you to do. To think like if you're in a religious situation, how would you lead the conversation away from doing something violent, basically? Okay, I think that's all. I can't think of anything else that I wanted to mention. Here, and we'll get going. I'm going to talk about just war and holy war today. Yes, today. And here on the PowerPoint that I made, and oftentimes I think people confuse and kind of not bind together, but combine these ideas of just war and holy war. They're not exactly the same thing, but since people usually combine them, I put them in the title. You can see here in the picture that I got, this is from some manuscript, and people would draw pictures in the manuscripts, and this is a picture, I believe it's in a manuscript, of from the First Crusade, a Christian war that was fought against Muslims in the Holy Land, in the area around Palestine, modern-day Israel today. And these are soldiers, and of course also people, because this seems to be a woman from the veil on her head. But there also seem to be soldiers, because this guy seems to be holding a weapon and dressed like knights, and they're carrying their standard, they're on horses, and they're being led by a religious figure. This is a man called Peter the Hermit. He was apparently a priest, but he was certainly a religious figure, Peter the Hermit. Although I don't know why he's called a hermit, since he's hanging out with so many people. By definition, hermits are people that they're usually religious types that stay to themselves. They stay inside places and buildings. Yes?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Just give me 1 second to finish my thought. Usually hermits will live in buildings by themselves, maybe in communities. There are communities of hermits, but each one has like his own apartment or her own apartment, if it's a woman. And they only come out maybe for worship and prayer with the other hermits, but then they spend the rest of the time themselves. So here he is leading a bunch of soldiers off to the Holy Land, to to Israel, to kill Muslims, and to take back the land from the Muslims who are in control. Yes, Miss Philistine.
Oh, a question. I know the papers with the artist in December.
Yes.
Right, but what time? Because I don't see the time.
It should. Yeah, it should be by the end of the day. It should. If it does not say that, I apologize. But it's always, things are always due the end of the day that they're due. So 11:59 p.m. on December 5th. So yeah. Thank you for asking the question. Okay, so according to the Oxford Dictionary of World Religions, which I looked up for this lecture, quote, "There is no religion in which the propriety of war in some circumstances is not admitted." I'll repeat that. There is no religion in which the propriety of war in some circumstances is not admitted. In other words, all religions, all of them, in some sense, under some circumstances, allow for warlike activity, allow for warfare. Does everyone want me to repeat that again? I don't know if anyone, because I did not put it on. Oh, I did put it on the PowerPoint. Silly me. Sorry about that. Actually, no, I did not. Yeah, I did put it on there. There is no religion in which propriety. Yes. It's not you. It sounds like... It's okay. I understand. It happens. So there is no religion in which the propriety of war in some circumstances is not admitted. War is... people fight each other. People fight each other. Persons fight people. Just persons fight persons. Tribes and clans, groups of people fight each other. On the national scale, nations fight nations, countries fight countries, so people fight each other. And when the group or the extent of the violence is large enough, whether the group is large enough or the extent of the violence is large enough, we oftentimes call that war. War. So nations go to war. We don't usually say they go to a street fight, where it's a fight. It's a war if it's two nations. And we will use war analogously, like we have gang wars or mob wars, and we'll talk about that. But that's, notice when the violence gets to a certain extent, when the violence is so great, we use terms like warfare to describe it. So what is war? Let's go back. I should have gone. I apologize that my PowerPoint slide was out of order. War is a state of conflict between groups of people. Okay, groups of people. Notice I don't say nation states necessarily, although it does include nations. But as I said, you can have gangs that go to war with each other. Okay, families that go to war with each other. The very famous episode in our country of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Okay. So it's a state of conflict between groups of people. Usually, religion's role in warfare has been in the development of laws governing warfare. Usually, religion's role is to limit warfare, to say what it can and cannot do, to come up with laws for that. But religion has been used for propagandistic purposes, for propaganda, us against them. Or they're of another religion, so we must hate them and we must destroy them. And so religion can be used and has been used to further the political goals of war. Because why? What does religion provide? Religion doesn't really provide the arms for warfare. It doesn't provide weapons, really. But it provides what one might call, and this is a quotation from an article in the Encyclopedia of Military Science, from an article on religion and war. This was written by a man named, I'm assuming it's a man, Carson Aidan Wilkie. What did I say? The Encyclopedia of Military Science. Science in the article on religion and war, he says that religion can give what he calls, quote, the veneer of moral loftiness. Now, a veneer is kind of like a coating. Think of like icing on a cake, okay, or on a bear claw that you get from your local store or something for breakfast. But it's a layer. So it can, and loftiness means something high up. So you understand these terms, I'm sure. But that's what religion can provide. That you have the high moral ground in your war. That you're always fighting on the side of right, on the side of God or the gods, and that your enemies always are not. They're always fighting on the side of evil. In fact, I can't think of one American war, any war that America has ever fought, that's ever been fought where we've said, you know, in this one, we're on the side of evil. You know, we're just going to have fun with it and be bad. I can't think of any war that we've ever. Can you? I mean, all our wars are always righteous. Always. And we know this because God has told us so. We are God's country. In God we trust. So, of course, God rubber stamps our wars. So religion can give the veneer of moral loftiness. Why are wars fought? Well, from a Western perspective, this is from a Western perspective, there are others, for example, I was just looking up his name because I always get it confused with somebody else. But if you want to get an idea of an Eastern view of warfare, then you would look to a man called Sun, but he's often called Sun Tzu, which is master Sun. Tzu just means master in Chinese, but the master Tzu. But for a Western view, we will look at this gentleman briefly called Karl von Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz. Who died in 1831. And he was a theorist on warfare and wrote about it. He's one of the most influential, he's not the only person to write about war, but he's one of the most influential war theorists. And for Clausewitz, or Clausewitz, as we would probably say in American English, he defined war as an extension of international politics. He viewed warfare as between nation states. And ordinarily, a nation would go to war when political purposes cannot be effectively achieved. Okay, so you try to talk first, you try to iron out your differences, try to make peace in some way, whatever the problem is. But if you can't, then you go to war. So your political purposes first, but if those cannot be met, then warfare might be the road or the avenue. War ends with a treaty that redefines the political relationship between those two nations that fought, and the treaty is proportionate to the military advantage of one side over the other, which is a fancy way of saying that whoever wins gets the good stuff, gets basically what they want. There is an exchange that goes on in a treaty where, in fact, even the victor or the winner might make some sort of reparations to the loser in order to pay back for damage that was inflicted during the warfare, because you don't want to completely destroy your enemy, because that might create a bigger problem in the future. But usually if it's being fought over a piece of territory and you win, you take the piece of territory, you take it back, or take it as you want it, if you can win. So that's what a treaty does. What happens when religion becomes involved? Well, the ends of war for Clausewitz are pretty clear. A nation can't meet its goals, the goals of its purpose with another nation. They go to war. One side either wins, one side wins, one side loses, and then they form a treaty relationship where their relationship is now defined by that victory, the victory of the one nation over the other. Okay? There's not necessarily anything religious about it. And it's clear, at least for Clausewitz, it's clear what's going on. The problem is religion adulterates that. When religion gets involved, it kind of muddies the water. The military objectives can become less clear once you inject, say, a different non-political motive, in this case, religion. So once you have religious objectives, in addition to political objectives, the religious objectives can actually narrow the range of compromise. Okay, with political objectives, you have all sorts of options. You can cease fighting for a period of time. You can call a truce. You can say we want the war to stop, and we'll have a treaty. We'll say nobody won, and we'll just have some sort of treaty relationship. Or maybe you can have a solution. Will be, one nation will say to the other, well, here are terms for peace between us. If you accept them, nobody's a winner, nobody's a loser, but if you accept them, then we now have these terms for peace that we will both live with, and the war will be called off. So you have options. You have a number of options. The war could continue, but you could just stop fighting for a while, which you call a ceasefire or a truce. And those relationships exist with our country. I mean, we are still technically, the United States of America is still technically at war with certain countries, like North Korea. The war with North Korea has never been resolved. There are no peace terms, but it's basically like a constant state of a ceasefire, where we're not militarily acting against them. We're not trying to invade North Korea, and North Korea is not trying to invade South Korea, so we're kind of at a stalemate. So you have some more options. With religion, Clausewitz thought, no, your options narrow, and compromise becomes less available. So when you inject something like religion, it impairs the possibilities for peace, and it can actually prolong the conflict. Why? Well, religion is about the transcendent, yes? Remember, what is religion? It's about ultimate reality. It's about the meaning and purpose of the universe and of human life. So it's not about necessarily clear, pragmatic, practical goals, as in politics. Okay? In politics, you can tell when a war has been won and when a country has lost. You can kind of tell these things. And that gives you something practical to work with so that you can go to the negotiating table and bring it to an end for both sides. With religion is, since the goals of religion are understood in spiritual terms, eternal terms that are not perceptible necessarily, perceivable, it can lead to unforeseen consequences in conducting the war, and can also bring up other difficulties. So it can bring up different problems, because now you're not just fighting for point X, but now you have point Y, which might be, well, the people you're fighting are now of a different religion. So it's not just that we want X, but we also want to convert them. Or we want to just outright destroy them because they shouldn't exist, because they're heretics or something. They're false believers. Okay, so now you've now increased the purposes, and you're no longer limited to one goal. You now have more than one goal. And this goal is not necessarily achievable. It might not be achievable to annihilate a whole group of people, to commit genocide against a religious group. It might not even be achievable or desirable. It might be madness to do it. It might create more problems than it solves, even from the religious perspective. So once the political center is lost, there is nothing to prevent the conflict from then spiraling into, say, a war of annihilation, or spiraling out of control into other areas that originally was not maybe the purpose of the conflict. Maybe the purpose of the conflict was one group was occupying a piece of land that was owned by another group. And the group that owns the land wants it back. They say, this is not your land, this is ours, the borders are clear, and we want you to leave. And the one group says, no, we're not going to leave. So you fight over it. But the one group maybe is of a different religion than the group that owns the land. So now it's like, well, what do we do? Oh, well, we should convert them too. Well, they won't convert. Well, then we have to kill them all because they believe in false religion, or they don't believe in our religion. So these issues can muddy the waters, is his point, basically. Not a good thing is the end result. For these reasons, wars that employ religious propaganda that bring religion into the mix oftentimes tend to be more destructive and more difficult to resolve. Think of Israel, Israel or Palestine. I know, or even Northern Ireland, which Christopher Hitchens liked to bring up. I say, brought up in his interview on CNN, which was not necessarily. I'll stick with Northern Ireland because people talk about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict all the time, but I mean, Northern Ireland, first of all, has deep roots. It goes back almost 1,000 years. I mean, when the English invaded, with the permission of the Pope, actually. So they asked permission from the Pope, and the Pope said, "Yeah, okay, I see. You should go in there and clean things up." They told the Pope that, the monasteries are in disarray. The monasteries are not being kept up. The monks aren't doing their jobs. People are not practicing their religion. And so, can we go, Pope? Can we go? Whether this was true or not is another question. The Irish might have had a different story to tell. But the English told the Pope their side, and the Pope agreed. So he said, blessing of Il Papa, and they invaded. And this was, I want to say the 1200s AD. So it's about almost 1,000 years, 800 years ago. Close enough. And that was it. England was in control of the island of Ireland since then. Not that the Irish liked it, but the thing is that at the time, they were both Catholics. There was no difference in religion between them. Okay? So the Irish lost the war and they were conquered. So they were under the control of the English. It was only in the 1500s when you had the Protestant Reformation and you had this different form of Christianity emerge called Protestantism, Protestant Christianity. And then further, it was only when the English kind of converted over to that, they went from being Catholics to being Protestant Christians. The Irish remained Catholics. That's when now you have this difference of religion, and that comes into play. That comes into the mix. So what was going on in Northern Ireland? Well, you could see it as a war of independence, basically. The Irish were always revolting against the English. That's part of their history. There were every now and then there were these revolts against the control of the English over the whole island of Ireland, and they never really went anywhere. But finally, they did in the last century. They were able to convince the British to give them some kind of autonomy, some kind of independence, and then there was another civil war, and another. I don't know how long it lasted, but I don't think it was very long. It was around the time, I think, of the First World War, or was it the Second World War? Because the Irish were neutral during one of those wars. I think it was the Second World War. They were neutral, but they gained their independence, except with this one caveat, with this one loss, that. There's a northern part of the island where there's the largest number of Protestant Christians and supporters of the British Crown, by the way. That part would be sectioned off, would be bordered off, and that would still remain part of the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and now Northern Ireland. But the rest of the island would be totally independent, and they could be whatever they wanted to be, which they eventually decided to be a republic, the Republic of Ireland. So you could see it as part of that war of independence. You have not necessarily Irish Catholics attacking British soldiers, but Irish freedom fighters who want to reunite all of the island of Ireland, who don't think the British government should be there. That's the way you could see it. Because it wasn't just Catholics who were doing it, and it wasn't just Protestants. I mean, that's like Christopher Hitchens focuses on in his interview, focused on the religious aspects of it. But this is where Clausewitz's point comes in, because once the religious aspects of it come into it, it becomes less clear what's going on there. Is it a religious war? Is it a war of independence? What is actually going on there? You've now got different things going on. So it becomes more destructive, and when religious propaganda gets involved, it becomes more destructive and more difficult to resolve the situation, because now it's us versus them. It's not Irish versus, well, that's also us versus them. It's these Catholics killing Protestants, and then Protestants kill Catholics, and it's all a religious thing. Okay, and how do you stop that from happening? But it doesn't necessarily have to be for religious reasons. I would just offer this in addition to what Clausewitz says. He talks about religious reasons can make things more destructive and difficult to resolve, but that could happen for other reasons as well, such as ethnic concerns. And back in the 1990s, in 1994, you had in this country called Rwanda in Africa, (1994). I'll show it to you on a map. Let me get out my map here, Google Maps. Nope. Uh-oh. Oh, I'm just standing really still. I thought the camera had frozen. Nope, I'm just standing really still. Okay, we go over into the middle of Africa. And here, right here, two tiny countries. This huge country called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This other country called Tanzania. This country called Uganda. And right in there, in between those countries, are these two little countries called Rwanda and Burundi. And in 1994, you had a genocide where you had these two groups called the Hutu and the Tutsi groups. Oh, darn it. I forgot my... I'm running over here, but I forgot to get my... The Hutu were the dominant group in the country, and the Tutsi were the minority group. And there were political issues going on, but anyways, I'm going to make a long story short. The Hutu started to kill the Tutsi members of the nation, and so there was a genocide that occurred, and it was purely ethnic. It was purely because are you a Tutsi? Yes, then I'm a Hutu, then I kill you, and vice versa as well. Although of course you could imagine the Tutsis were doing it in self-defense. There had been a civil war before that, which people thought was resolved. But it wasn't. And so the Hutu government, the Hutu majority government, decided to take an opportunity to start trying to kill off all the Tutsis. No more Tutsis, then you don't have any more civil war, any problems, no one challenging your power. Well, it didn't happen that way. It didn't work out. They didn't kill off the Tutsis. In fact, the Tutsis went back to civil war, fighting the Hutu government, and eventually won, and were able to bring peace, at least the ceasing of killing of their fellow ethnic group, members of their fellow members of their ethnic group. So it's not just religion that can cause warfare to go out of control. What started as a civil war, which could have was resolved, people thought it was resolved, once it was expanded to include ethnicity, are you a Hutu, are you a Tutsi, turned into a bloodbath. Okay? Be right back. I forgot my my paper to wipe the board. All right. Sorry about that. Some religions, back to my PowerPoint here. Some religions do not have a concept of war at all. Now, how does that jibe with my previous statement that no religion has this statement that there's under some circumstances warfare is justified. Well, what I mean is there are some religions that, yes, while warfare can be justified under some circumstances, there are some religions that also have a concurrent tradition, a tradition running along it called pacifism, peace building. So you have religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Christianity, which, while yes, they do have conditions under which war can be conducted, they also do have or did have a strong pacifist tradition. It seems like, well, I guess it was the holidays, so it doesn't seem like anyone really cleaned the... You okay? You okay? Cleaned off the board. It's okay, I'm just mentioning it. Just chattering to myself out loud. What did I say? Oh, Jainism. We just wanted to write it down in case you didn't know how to spell it. Jainism. And what is pacifism? Pacifism is the belief that a person should not oppose, or should be non-resistant to the use of violence in a dispute. Excuse me, I made that mistake on my PowerPoint. That a person should not oppose or not be resistant to the use of violence in settling a dispute. Okay, so just take note of that with pacifism, my little mistake here. That a person should not oppose. Just correct it so there's no confusion. Bless you. Okay, so you don't use any type of violence to respond to aggressive or violent behavior. Okay, and so for example, a religion like Buddhism. Buddhism was founded by a man named Gautama Siddhartha. That's his name. His family name is Gautama. The family name comes first in Eastern cultures. His given name was Siddhartha. Did I put his dates down? No, I didn't. Oh, yeah, I did. Good. 556 to 483 BC. What did I say? 550. Memory. 563. Excuse me. 563. Not going to work. 563. 483. 563. Actually, I should put BCE, excuse me. And one of it's called the Buddha, it's called Buddhism just because that's a title that was given to him, the awakened one. That's what Buddha means. I think I mentioned it before in the class. It means the awakened one. He is the one who awakened to reality, to the real situation of the world and the way it is. And Buddhism stresses right conduct. One of the problems with the world, according to the Buddha, or Gautama, is, Mr. Gautama, is that people are craving things. People have desires. They desire permanence in the world, and there really is no permanence in the world because everything is changing. And part of his plan, and it's a whole plan, I'm just giving you a very bare bones idea of it. There are various things that you need to do in order to deal with the fact that life is not permanent, that you even yourself are not permanent. You change and you grow and you are different all the time. There is no real unity to the human person. And one of these things that will allow you to see that is right conduct. And right conduct includes the non-harming of other beings. Notice it doesn't say loving. The Buddha didn't teach love. He talked about compassion. And even compassion is not love truly. It's non-harming. So just not doing harm to others, which is a good start. but that's kind of where it can end as well, because Buddhism is very self-centered in its viewpoint. You're not here for others necessarily. You're here to bring yourself to enlightenment. And then you can worry about bringing others to enlightenment as well. Jainism emerges in India around the 800s to the 600s BC. From a variety of teachers. There's a whole traditional list of teachers that are said to have taught the doctrine of Jainism from millions of years ago. But from what we know historically, around sometime between the 800s and 600s BC, you have some people, some historical figures who are teaching this idea of Jainism, and it's mainly associated with the last teacher, whose name is Vardhamana. Vardhamana. Actually, put it down here under Jainism just so people can see it on the video. Vardhamana. Okay. And again, some related to Buddhism. Scholars think there is some kind of cross-pollination, cross-filtering going on here with Buddhism and Jainism. Not the least of which is from the fact that the Buddhists don't like the Jainists. It's like, you're stealing our shtick. You're stealing our idea. The Jainists are like, you're stealing our ideas. The Buddhists stole our ideas. And the Buddhists are like, no, but we know the true way to nirvana, and you don't. So there are conflicts between the Buddhists and the Jains. But again, this emphasis on restraint, which meant nonviolence towards all living things. Non-harming all living things. Not just human beings, but animals as well, and even insects and other things like the grass and trees for Jains. There are levels of being, okay, in the whole spectrum of what things you're not supposed to harm. Obviously, sometimes you can't avoid walking on grass, but you should, of course, never kill an elephant because it's a higher level of being than a blade of grass. But the point is nonviolence. So these traditions have a definite idea of nonviolence. So does Christianity. Christianity, because of Jesus' teachings, Jesus of Nazareth, call him Jesus for short, who lived from around 6 BCE to 30, around circa, to around circa 33 CE, taught love of enemies, doing no harm to those who harm you. Okay, so again, this idea of non-harming. Okay, so these three religions have a tradition of pacifism. There are other religions that have no tradition of pacifism and never have, and those would be Judaism and Islam. War is acceptable in both Judaism and Islam, as you probably can tell from the readings. I gave you the reading from the book of Deuteronomy in the Jewish Bible, and I asked you also to do an extra reading from the Quran, which is really a rather weird reading, which I'll talk about in a moment. But anyways, from the Holy Book of Islam. So in Islam, there really is nothing similar to that. There may be now, but at least in the origins of these religions, there is no indication of a tradition of pacifism. Nevertheless, almost every major religion, even those with strong traditions of nonviolence, like Buddhism, Jainism, and you could say to some extent Christianity, almost every major religion has rules of some kind for the allowance or the permission of violence and war. And we looked at some of them before I go on to just war. In the readings, we looked at the book of Deuteronomy, and we looked at a reading from the Quran. the reading from the Quran I have highlighted here. The reading I found it just weird was because I highlighted the sections, here you can see them in yellow. There are 3 sections that deal with warfare and fighting, and actually there aren't 3 sections, there's actually 2, because this goes on to one more page. So actually only 2 chunks that deal with fighting and war. So, I mean, I'm trying to figure out what the rest of it here is meant to be. I guess they want to give context in the book, because, I mean, the name of the book is Princeton Readings in Religion and Violence, and from Princeton University Press, and what they're trying to give you are readings from various religions that deal with violence. So, maybe what they're trying to show you from this reading is how little the Quran actually talks about war and violence, as they tell it to you in the introduction. If you read the introduction to this chapter from the Quran, you know, the Quran, the man Muhammad who received these revelations really does not talk very much about violence towards other people or war. That's not the purpose of the Quranic message. This man Muhammad, who lived, I know he died in 632 CE. Well, I'll put down his death date because I forget when he was born. I want to say 580, but I could be wrong about that. I'll put a question mark next to 580. I think it was 580, but he died in 632 CE. So maybe that was the point. But anyways, nevertheless, they talk about it. So what can we say about these 2 things? I mean, just these 2 readings. What can give you some context? The book of Deuteronomy is it's a book in the Bible. It's the 5th book of the Bible, and it actually completes kind of the law section of the Bible for Jews. This whole section, these first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah, the instruction, the teaching. We in English sometimes translate it as the law. Okay. So it contains all the basic laws that God gives to the Jews for their life. And within these laws, in this book, Deuteronomy, which contains laws, someone has stuck, and I say stuck because you see that it's not just in one place. You have chapter 20, 21, 23, 24. Just someone has stuck miscellaneous rules about warfare into other laws. The longest portion is here in chapter 20, when it talks about what are you supposed to do at the beginning of a war, and then when the war is being conducted, and it basically focuses on sieging a city. You know, it's not open warfare. They're talking about when you come upon a city of foreigners, how should you treat them? Should you just completely destroy everything, everybody, or should you, should you enslave them? Okay, the book of Deuteronomy says, well, if they're close by, destroy them because they might contaminate you with their bad ideas. So if it's a town that's nearby, then you should kill everyone in the town. But if it's a town that's far away, far enough away that you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to worry about being affected by it, then in that case, if the people say they surrender, you don't have to kill everybody. You just, you enslave them. Yes. Actually, in the city, did they kill everybody or just the men? Here. Who said that? Ms. Marquez, thank you. Do you know? You see where it says that? Oh, okay. Yes, I see it. That's in a city far away. Yeah, if it's a city far away, yes. You kill the men and you enslave the women and children. Yes, you'll take as plunder. Where you shall besiege it, you call males to the sword. But where did it say you enslave them? I thought it said that you would take them as slaves. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, if it responds to you peaceably, right above it. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace. If they accept your terms of peace, then you can enslave them. But if they make no peace with you and you fight them and win, then you put all the men in the city to the sword, and the women and the children and the livestock and everything else is your spoil. It's your stuff. You divide it up how you decide. However, it says, thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here. Okay? For the cities of the people in the land that the God was giving them, no, there were no terms of, well, I guess, I don't even know if there are any terms of peace. It says you shall devote them to complete destruction. So I don't even think you offered them terms of peace. They had to be completely destroyed, so that they may not teach you to do according to their abominable practices that they have done for their gods. And so you sinned against the Lord your God. Ooh. So the God of Israel pulls no punches. What do you do when you're taking captives for one of these cities and you happen to see a beautiful woman? Of course, written for men. You see a beautiful woman and you want to take her as your wife. Well, it gives you rules for that as well. How are you supposed to live in the camp? And these are good rules to follow, but especially good rules for men. If you've ever had a boyfriend and you've seen how he leaves the bathroom, then you know what I'm talking about. You go into the bathroom and you look around and you're like, how did that get there? Doesn't he know how to point? Anyways, because it says, the Lord wants a clean camp. Make sure that when you go out to do your business, to pee or to poop, that you have your trowel with you, your little shovel, so that you can dig a hole and then you can cover it up once you're done. You're not living like animals, because the Lord walks amongst you. And the Lord wants a clean camp. I find interesting about these rules. One thing that's interesting, because I'll ask it on a test, wink, wink, hint, hint, is that notice in the beginning of the rules on warfare in chapter 20, when the Israelites are preparing to go out to war, who is the first person to address them, to speak to them? Yes?
It says priest.
A priest. Yeah, a religious figure. Before any of the military commanders come out to talk to the men, you send out the priest. And the priest says, shall say to them, blah, 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 priest shall come forward and say, hear Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart be faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of your enemies. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. So he gives them the promise that God is on, literally says that God is on your side, basically. When I say literally. But he actually says God is on your side. God is fighting for you. And he has already given you the victory. So that's how you should fight. Okay? So this obviously has religious connotations. I mean, here you have, at least in Judaism, where religion is directly embedded in the act of warfare. I mean, you have the priest approving of it, saying this is basically God's will. Okay? So go out and fight. Do I want to say anything? Quote from there, I can move on with that. In the Quran, it's a little bit different, as it mentions in the introduction that they wrote to it. It notes the fact, which is rather interesting, that in no case in the Quran is God himself shown as fighting. God does not undertake the fight for the people. Rather, angels and men, angels and human beings, are the ones who fight. Angels are spiritual beings without bodies. But they fight. God or Allah does not fight. I don't know why, but maybe because he is most merciful. That's how he's often described. And if you did the reading, you see it says several times, for Allah, or God, it basically means God in Arabic. but they oftentimes leave it untranslated. For God is often forgiving. He is most merciful. So maybe that's why God doesn't fight. In the sections that do talk about fighting and warfare in verses, beginning with verse 190, fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for Allah loveth not transgressors. Okay, so if a person fights you, and I think Islamic scholars, Muslim scholars would understand this defensively. If someone fights you first and you defend yourself, okay, but do not break limits. Do not go beyond the limit that you need to in order to defend yourself. There are limits. However, slay them wherever you catch them. Okay, so all right. Let us know what you think, Lord. And turn them out from where they have turned you out. For tumult and oppression are worse than slaughter. And this phrase, tumult and oppression are worse than slaughter, occurs in the other section on fighting. And I'm not an expert in the Quran, but if just as a person reading it as an outsider, I think what it means that the killing of war is not as bad than letting things be in disorder and chaos, letting people just be harmed unjustly without any response. So what does it say? Tumult, which is kind of unrest, and oppression, people pushing you down. Think of structural violence. Allowing those unjust situations to exist are worse than a just war for a just cause, defending yourselves and your rights. I think that's what it means. But if they cease, it says in verse 122, if they stop fighting you, then stop fighting you. Okay? And remember that if they stop fighting you, Allah is very forgiving and most merciful. I don't know if I want to say anything more about that. Well, it does. You cannot fight. You should not fight the sacred mosque. And by the sacred mosque, it means the place of worship in the city of Mecca, which is in the country of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so there are mosques all over the place, all over the world for Muslims, but the most sacred of the mosques is in the holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and so you should never fight there. Unless, of course, again, you have to. If Mecca is the name of the city, sacred mosque. Remember when we talked about the word sacred. Sacred is a place that's cut off. It has boundaries, and you cannot do the normal things that you might do in the world in these sacred places. And yeah, you might say, well, Dr. Dunn, didn't you say before that war is not normal? It's abnormal time. Yeah, that's true. But it's the thing that peoples do to each other. Okay? And so it should not, since it is something that you find out in the world, it should not be something you find in a sacred space like.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. Something that you should find in a sacred space. And there are not just sacred spaces, but sacred times. Because it mentions the sacred mosque, but later on when we get to verses 216 and following, it mentions the prohibited month. I believe that's the month of pilgrimage. I believe that the prohibited month will be the month of pilgrimage, when Muslims who can are required to take a trip to Mecca, to the sacred mosque. They have to participate in various rituals and things that happen over a bunch of days. Okay, so again, that's a time when you should not be fighting either. Fighting therein is a grave offense. However, it is a graver offense in the sight of God to prevent access to the path of God, to deny Him, to prevent access to the sacred mosque, and to drive out its members. Okay then, so if you have people who are trying to prevent people from making the pilgrimage, or who invade the sacred mosque and try to take it away, well, even though you're not supposed to fight in the sacred mosque and fight during the holy month of Hajj, pilgrimage, Hajj, I should say, well, you might have to. Okay, so Allah is practical in that sense. Just war. No, not just war, but just war. Can you have a just war? Well, some religions think so, and I'm mainly going to focus here on Christianity. That does not mean that, this is not a course on Christianity, and it's not a Christian school, so don't think that that's what I'm here. I'm not trying to push any view. I'm just saying that most of what we are going to talk about with just war is based on Christian teachings, especially Roman Catholic ones. Why? Because that's the group that has focused a lot and developed these teachings more so than other groups. Maybe other religions have not maybe developed them to the depth that, say, Roman Catholicism and Christianity in general have. And the Catholic tradition on war is a long one, and it's a complex one. It goes back to Jesus. Okay? Christians were thinking about war and violence and how to deal with them. Why? Because central to the tradition of Christianity is the presumption. It's a presumption which is binding on all Christians, and that presumption is, do no harm to your neighbor, especially if your neighbor is an enemy. You should not do harm to an enemy. So that is the presumption of the Christian worldview, which they've received from their founder, Jesus. And in fact, how the enemy is treated, how you treat your enemy, is a key test of whether one truly loves one's neighbor. So to consider even taking a human life must be done with the utmost hesitation. Nevertheless, the tradition admits that one can move from these presumptions of loving one's neighbor and even loving one's enemy. One can move from those presumptions to a justifiable use of force, provided that the demand of justice is met. Demands of justice. So this is that's what just war doctrine is trying to do here. It's a teaching that's trying to show that under certain circumstances and with certain conditions, war can be morally justified, is morally justifiable. Come back to our friend Augustine of Hippo. We come back to our friend Augustine of Hippo here. Augustine, who died in 430 CE. He is, for Christianity, he is the origin or the originator of the idea. For Augustine, war is the result of sin. Sin, which is violations of God's will, is theological terminology, a Christian theological terminology. So if something is contrary to God's will, it is called a sin. And that's how I'll be using it. So for Augustine, war is a result of humankind's sin, and also war acts as a remedy for sin in political society. So when a society has become so sinful, war might act as a remedy against that, kind of as a punishment from God for a society's sin. War itself comes from disordered ambitions. People want different things, and sometimes people want something too much, and they want it so much that they're willing to fight for it and to kill other people for it. So their ambition is disordered. Maybe it's not worth it. but they still want it. See, that's where the disorder comes in. However, war could be used to restrain evil, and war could be used to protect the innocent. In the case of an attack on an innocent person or people, the presumption that I mentioned before of loving your enemy, the presumption of not harming your enemy, of loving your enemy, yields to the command, yields to also the desire to protect the innocent. So the command of love that Christ gives, that Jesus gives, has to kind of fall down under the requirement of justice, of helping someone in need who is being oppressed. So if an innocent person is being harmed, I have a duty, yes, Jesus told me not to, to love my enemy, but if my neighbor is trying to harm somebody, even kill another person, well, that commandment to love my neighbor has to kind of take second place to another commandment, which is to protect the helpless and those who are in need, and to even maybe intervene to stop my neighbor from doing harm to another person. I have that obligation. I can't just stand back and say, well, what she's doing is wrong, trying to kill that person, but on the other hand, I can't kill her because I'm supposed to turn the other cheek. I'm supposed to love my enemy. And I'll pray for my enemy. I'll pray that she stops trying to do that. No, there's another value also, which is to defend the life of another. So that's what I mean when I say that the idea of loving your enemy comes to play second place to another value. According to, and I'll say this and then we have our break, Judith Dwyer, who wrote the article on war in the New Dictionary of Theology. Dwyer, expert, presumably in just war. I'll assume that's why they had her write the article. Quote, while the just war argument has taken several forms in the history of Catholic theology, this Augustinian insight remains its central premise. Okay, what is the central Augustinian insight? That war, it comes from humankind's sin, it is an evil thing, and that in the case of an attack or a war on a person who is innocent, I, even as a Christian who is supposed to love my enemy, may have to go to war with my enemy to stop him or her from attacking the innocent. So I think that's the insight she's referring to. Okay, this essential insight, essential premise. The command of love yields to the command of helping the oppressed and helping those who are in need of help. Okay, so we'll take our break and we'll come back to this. No, I don't want to turn it off. righty. Back to the just war. Well, getting to the just war. You have to remember that Augustine, the thing about Augustine is that he doesn't state his views all in one place. I mean, you have to kind of bring them together. He answers, he gives his views in certain here and there in different places in different works that he writes, different books or letters. One of those places where he mentions some of these ideas, he doesn't develop them very much, but he mentions them, is the letter to Boniface, or Epistula 189. Epistula just is a Latin abbreviation. It's the abbreviation for the word epistula. This is the abbreviation for the word epistula, which means letter. Letter 189 to this man Boniface. We don't know who Boniface is. We only know who he is basically from Augustine's letters to him. He apparently was a soldier, and he was a Christian, and he had some questions about his service, being a Christian, and his service as a soldier in the Roman army. And so he addressed some of these questions to Augustine, who wrote him, admittedly, as Augustine says in his letter, very quick and brief reply. So he doesn't go into great detail about things, but just is basically saying to Boniface, yes, it's okay that you're a soldier fighting in the Roman army. That's okay. That's don't worry about that. Don't have any scruples about that. But he does give him general rules for how he should act. So, for example, Augustine says that war should be waged for peace. It should always be waged for peaceful purposes, not for the purposes of just destroying, and only as a last resort. War should be a last resort. One should be peaceful towards the combatants, even your enemies, even those you're fighting against, you should be peaceful towards them. You can see a theme here, the theme of peace. Peace is the norm, not war. Okay. One should kill only if necessary, and one should show mercy to the conquered. So to those, once you defeat your opponents, you should show mercy to them. You shouldn't just enslave them all or kill them all, kind of as you saw in Deuteronomy chapter 20. So there's been some kind of development and idea here between whoever wrote the rules in Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, and Augustine, who wrote this letter to a man named Boniface. Augustine is the one who seems to be the originator of the idea of a just war, but it is this man Gratian who comes later, and who lived in the 1100s CE, the 1100s, the 12th century, and the FL means fluoruite. It's an abbreviation for epistula, which means letter, and fluoruite is another abbreviation from Latin, which means flourished. So it means that he flourished in the 1100s, which basically means that we don't know when he lived. We know from the evidence of this book, which I'll mention in a moment, that was published in 1148, that he must have been alive around the time of 1148 because this book was published by him. But other than his name and the book and the general idea of when he must have been alive, we don't know. So he flourished in the 1100s CE. This man Gratian appears to have been an Italian bishop. So from Italy, a bishop. Maybe he was a monk, but scholars don't think so. I think that's wrong. He was a church lawyer, so he was concerned about the laws by which the Catholic Church were run, and he brought those laws together into a coherent whole in this work called the Concordia Discordantium Canonum, or more briefly called the Decretum Gratiani. This is not a picture of him. We have no idea what he looked like, but this was someone's imagination. In a copy of the Decretum, they put this little picture of just a person that they're calling Gratian, but that's probably not what he looked like. But here's his name, Gratianus Monachus. well, and the order of monks they believe he was part of, well, monachos, I should say. He was probably not a monachos. He was probably not a monk. He was an Italian bishop, from what we can tell. Certainly, he was a church lawyer. The name of his book is Bringing Concord or Peace Towards Discordant Canons. So it is the book which brings sense. It makes sense out of all the church laws that were, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, discordant. I'm looking for a word other than discordant, that were maybe contradictory. Okay, so bringing order to chaos is basically, if you really want to boil down the name of what this means in Latin, bringing order to chaos, the chaos of the church's laws. Because there were so many laws, and they were spread out in all sorts of different documents, until his decree, his decretum, no one had really brought them all together into one place. So that was his claim to fame. He wrote this book in which he brought together all the canons, and canon is a technical term for a law in church law. Canon, notice, with one N, not two. Okay, a canon with two N's is a boom cannon. Boom! That you fire at people. This is not that. A canon is a standard, and it basically has the meaning of law. Okay? So the church's laws, the canons, were contradictory. There are many of them, and they needed to be, and you had to work to find them. They were not all in one place. So he thought, well, let me take all of these discordant canons. They're spread out all over the place. There's discord. There's a lack of peace. Let me bring peace to all of them. Let me bring them all together into a harmony in one work. So concordia, bringing concord or peace to the discord. Okay? That's the explanation of the name. What it comes to be called is the Decree of Gratian, or Decretum Gratiani in Latin, as it was published in 1148. So with this, as a compiler, this brought about this process of systematizing, because now you had everything in one place. So you could look at all the different laws that had to relate to warfare and wartime, and you could start to build on that and maybe create your own system of theology about it, a theology of war, or your own system of thinking about how should Christians fight war. As you might expect, Gratian's definition of just war drew heavily upon Augustine. And before Gratian, there was really no unified body of Christian teaching on just war, just these isolated and occasional statements. So a coherent doctrine could now be created largely on the foundation of his decretum, of the work he did in the decretum, of bringing together all these different laws on all sorts of different topics, not just war, but war was one of them. And so now you could have a coherent doctrine. Another person to mention in this history of the development of just war is our friend, well, I didn't write his name here, but our friend Thomas Aquinas, who we've heard of before. We read a little bit from him in his section on religion. He died in 1274 CE. I think I was going to give a reading from him on, I don't remember if I did. Did I give a reading from him on war? Did I? Was that in the readings? Does anyone remember? Do you remember? It was? Okay. I thought I did, because I had two. One on religion and one on warfare. And the question on warfare was, is it licit? Is it legal to go to war? Is it a good, well, not a good thing, but is it possible to conduct warfare as a Christian? So, okay, thank you. I wasn't sure. I forgot whether I removed that reading or not. Anyways, so this is from that reading. Thomas Aquinas was a fantastic systematizer. He asks all sorts of questions in this work, the Summa Theologiae, which means summary of theology. So he asks all sorts of questions about theology, belief in God, etc., and so forth. And then he gives objections. And he'll give different objections. He'll ask a question, and then he'll give different objections. So just for sake of argument, does God exist? I don't think he asks that question, but let's just say for sake of argument. Does God exist? And then he'll give different, arguments, objections to that. It seems that God does not exist because X. Objection 1. Objection 2. It seems also that God does not exist because of Y. Blah, 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 blah. And then he will give a response. He'll say, but I answer that such and such. He'll give a very brief response saying why he believes. Say, for example, I answer that God does exist because of such and such. And then after that, after he gives his short response, and sometimes not so short, sometimes the responses are longer, he will respond objection by objection. He'll go back and say, okay, in objection 1, the response was there is no God because of X, and this is not correct because of this reason. So, he really listens to those who oppose him or to those ideas that are not his own. It's not just his own voice. He's in conversation with other ideas. So he's a great systematizer. And he asks the question is asked, is it licit to go to war? Is it a duty to go to war sometimes? And he lists the objections. No, it is not possible for various reasons. No, so he lists them and then he responds that yes, it is possible. There is a thing called a just war. Okay? This is and I give you the source up there if you ever wanted to look it up. Where I'm getting it from, the second part of second volume. So you have basically 3 volumes to his Summa. He never finished it, so he died before he was able to finish it. So you have volume 1, then volume 2, which is in 2 parts. So you have part 1 and part 2 of volume 2, and then you have volume 3. So this is from the second part of the second volume. So the second of the second. Question 40, if you ever want to look it up. Would anyone like to read this from St. Thomas Aquinas? Tommaso Aquino. Thomas of Aquin. Huh?
Also, he's raising his hand.
So you're giving them up to me, eh? You've been volunteered, Mr. Diaz. Yeah, I see your hand. Go ahead, sir.
I answer that in order for war to be just, directly necessary. First, the authority of sovereign.
Whoops, sorry. Hold on. I'm in the way. Okay. Sorry, start again, please.
I answer that in order for war to be just, 3 things are necessary. First, there is the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged. Secondly,
No, you can read the rest. Read a little bit.
an individual to court because he can very just of his rights from the tribunal.
Trust.
Moreover, it is not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, but has to be done in wartime. As the care of the commonweal is committed to those who are in authority, to watch over the commonweal of the city, but is subject to them. Secondly, a just cause is required. Mainly that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it of some fault. Thirdly, necessary that have personal intention, and the advancement of good or evil.
Yes, thank you, sir. Religion. Yeah, oh, sorry, sinful was the word. Whether it is always sinful to wage war. Okay, so this is the reading from that. So he has there are 4 objections, and then he says, on the contrary, he says, that he's just raising an objection to the objections, and then he gives his answer. Okay? And the objections are saying that, no, it's always sinful to wage war. He says, no, there are cases when it is not. But if war is waged, these are the three essential conditions: that it must be a competent authority, a sovereign authority that calls it. These are the most basic conditions. A sovereign authority, a just cause, and a rightful intention. Why? Because I personally, or you and I personally, do not have the authority to call the whole country to war. Okay? Even as a group, we don't have that authority. If we in the class decided to take a vote that the country should go to war against a certain other country, say, I don't know, Vanuatu, which is an island out in the Pacific, a nation out in the Pacific. We don't, even as a group, we don't have that authority. And even as a people, we don't necessarily we have that authority in a sense, because we delegate our authority, the people delegate their authority to those who are in Congress. And even then, within Congress, it's only the Senate, technically, that can declare war on another nation state. I don't believe the House of Representatives even has that power. Nor does the president. Now, do presidents do that? Yeah, they kind of do. But technically, it's the Senate that's supposed to do that. Usually what happens is the president does it, and then the Senate rubber stamps it. But it's a whole other cup of coffee. Anyways, so it has to be a sovereign authority, something that's recognized over the whole community. In Aquinas' day, they didn't have, America did not exist, so they didn't have our form of government. But he's thinking here like of princes and kings and aristocrats who would, be over the people, and they would be the people who decide. So, but it's, it doesn't really make much of a difference, I think. And a just cause is required. The people who are attacked should deserve to be attacked. So that's his idea of what a just cause is. They've done something that deserves a violent response. And it should be done but even if these two conditions are met, that a sovereign would say yes and that the cause is just, nevertheless the intention must be right. It must be for the advancement of good. It's never for the advancement of evil or hatred or just simple destruction. It could also be done for the avoidance of evil. So war could be, and from Aquinas' view, preventative. It could be, in a sense, not just defensive, but you're trying to prevent an evil from happening. So you could maybe strike first, I guess. These principles, these essential principles of sovereign authority, just cause, rightful intention, as summarized by Aquinas, would be further developed in the succeeding ages into what we call the just war doctrine. Which I already gave you that definition, so I can move on. There are two parts to the just war doctrine. There is the first, the preliminary, whether one can go to war, first and foremost, and then during the war, how one should act. And to describe these two parts, we use two Latin phrases. Those two Latin phrases are jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum, as you can see in Latin, literally means the law or the right to war, as in to go to war, or as could be translated poetically, the right to fight. Jus in bello in Latin has the sense of the law during war or in war, or as it could also be translated poetically, doing right during the fight. To do right during the fight. Jus ad bellum shows us that war is not inevitable. There has to be a good reason which gives the right to fight. You just don't have that right by nature. You know, you just don't have that right of wanting to go, just going to war and declaring war because on a whim, because you want to. There has to be some action, some situation that has given you on your side the right to pursue war as your redressal, your way of redressing it. However, it should be said that rights don't always have to be exercised. You know, I might have a right to fight somebody, but I could also choose to suffer an injustice if fighting that person would be more damaging, would cause more damage than just letting it go and suffering through the injustice. Sometimes countries do this, you know. They just decide, well, we could, maybe what that country did to us was kind of an act of war technically, but we'll let it go because we're not going to go to war over this, you know. Jus in bello, even in the conduct of war, in the case of jus in bello during the war, its practice is dangerous. War is dangerous, and so the conduct of war must be limited. You can't just do anything or attack anything just because it's wartime and it's in the, as they call it, the theater of war, the area where war is being perpetrated. What are the conditions for the jus ad bellum? Summary, but maybe a confusing summary. I'll pass over that. Well, there are several, and you should probably learn them or at least be familiar with them because they will show up on the quiz, as you might imagine. The conditions for a just war or jus ad bellum, first of all, the essential ones of a competent authority. The war must be declared by a duly constituted, competent, and public authority. It should be public. It's not private. War is not a private enterprise. This is it's a public thing that's going to involve everybody, and so it should be publicly declared by an authority that has that ability. And by doing this, it grants the permission to initiate the war. It gives people now permission to go out a-killing. I guess there's no better way to put it than that way, you know, to get their guns and to go out to fight, or to send the armies to go fight and die. The second the second is just cause. The cause must be truly just, meaning that it must really be undoing an injustice. Okay, we've talked about injustice before when we talked about violence. And to be justice is to give to someone what is that person's due, what is due that person. So for it to be a just war, you can't be doing it for an unjust reason, like doing it just for yourself. You're doing it because there is an imbalance here. Something that was due to someone or something has not been given. And so you're undoing that injustice. The cause also should be defense against an aggressor. Defense, and that should be probably the primary position, that a just cause should be, of course, certainly defensive rather than aggressive. Even if you're going to try to undo an injustice. Now, what are some of the things that a just cause can embody? Well, a just cause can embody the following: to take back what was taken away wrongfully. Okay, something was taken wrongfully from you. Take back what was taken wrongfully. Everyone can see completely to see what's on the board here, but sorry if I had it positioned correctly. I hate the camera on this thing. They put it on the bottom rather than on the top, so it makes it just that much harder to get both me and the camera, or get me and the board. Anyway, so I'll do that in a moment. Well, got to deal with it. To take back or to regain what was taken wrongfully, to punish evil, is another just cause, to punish evil. And to defend against aggression. Defend against, I should say, actual or potential aggression. So those are three things that can embody a just cause. Who was a church lawyer, a canon lawyer who lived in the 1500s, Francis de Vittoria. Died in 1546. He was an esteemed, a famous canon lawyer, expert in church law. In writing about just cause, he declared clearly, quote, "Difference of religion is not a cause of just war." So I thought that was a very important little quotation. Where did I find that? That was in the Westminster Dictionary of Christian Ethics, in the article on just war. We made a point of quoting him to that effect, which I find is very interesting. So here you have a Catholic authority saying, look, there are certain conditions that are just causes for war. Taking back what was taken wrongfully, punishing evil, defending against aggression. But just simply being of different religions is not a just cause to initiate war. So it's not enough to say, oh, well, we're Catholics and they're Protestants, therefore we should go to war with them and try to change them into Catholics. That's not a just cause. And Pope Pius XII, actually, I guess I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this in a second, as I put this on this PowerPoint slide. Pope Pius XII, who died in 1958, further developed this idea of just cause, saying that just cause should be restricted to self-defense, which is rather interesting because if you're kind of thinkers and scholars and theologians and you're thinking about what he said about that just cause should really be limited solely to self-defense, that would seem to remove the right to even punish an offense or the right to recover. Okay, so punishing, if it's just self-defense, this one, then was he saying that you don't have the right, it's not a just cause to punish evil, it's not a just cause to recover what was taken? I mean, that's a debate that Catholic scholars might have. Nevertheless, he seemed to limit it just to the realm of self-defense. So that does constitute a development in the teaching. The next one is the right intention. So that the force intended in a war, a just war, should only be used solely in the pursuit of the just cause. The force that's used is not used for hatred, it's not used for revenge. So sometimes you'll hear people say, bomb them back into the Stone Age, or kill them all. Well, once you start hearing those things, you might ask yourself, is this fulfilling one of the essential conditions for a just war? Sometimes people are speaking just out from their hearts and they're angry or whatever, they don't really mean it. But sometimes people do mean it. And then that might show that there's not really they might have a just cause for warfare, but they might not have the right intention, which can poison the cause. Now I have these in bold and underlined with asterisks to indicate, and they're in larger type, to indicate that these are the three essential conditions that come to us from Thomas Aquinas, but we have some lesser ones. For example, comparative justice. Remember, justice is to give to someone what someone is owed. And so, in comparative justice, we are comparing, it's balanced, achieving a balance. We are comparing whether the rights and values that the war is going to be fought over are serious enough to involve killing. Okay, you might have a just cause. You might have a right intention for fighting the war. You might even have a sovereign authority, a competent authority that says, yes, you can go to war if you want to. But then when you look at it, you see that the injustice suffered by one party does not significantly outweigh the injustice that will be suffered by the other. In other words, that you're looking at how much damage the war is going to do and is it worth it? Or are you, well actually no, I shouldn't say that. That's proportionality. What you're looking at is the situation worthy of a violent response? So for example, let's say you have a dispute over a border, okay, a border line. And you say that one side says the border should be here, another group says no, the border should be there, or should be right where it is, whatever. And okay, fine. Maybe you might go to war over that, or might feel that you're justified in going to war over that. But do you send a nuclear bomb and bomb the other country in order to destroy them, so that then you can say, okay, this is where we won, now we're going to draw the border where we think it should be. It's comparative justice. You're comparing the situation to what it is, a border dispute, and maybe no killing at all is worth that. But certainly overkilling is not worth it. Okay? So the injury that is suffered by one side, say dropping a nuclear bomb and killing everybody on the other side, outweighs the injustice of, well, we think the border line has been drawn wrong, and we think it should be here. Because you have other options. You can negotiate it. You could still maybe fight over it, and maybe there might be some killing or some harm, but not significant enough that, by comparative justice standards, it's significant. But overkilling, like blowing everything up, that might be a violation of comparative justice. The situation ensued. For example, in the case of the war in the Russo-Ukrainian war, where you did have the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, kind of mention, and I don't know if he said it more than once, but I think he said it at least once, that there might be a nuclear bomb response under certain conditions in the war. And, President Biden, or at least our advisors to President Biden, or whatever, American officials had to make very clear to President Putin that if there is anything nuclear that happened, there would be a nuclear response. Maybe, I don't know if they said there would be a nuclear response. There would certainly be a response that would obliterate the Russian military capacity. Something like that. Whether that might include an actual nuclear response, who knows? It might just include using the full force of our military and our satellites and every piece of technology we have, even virtual, like internet attacks, to completely immobilize and destroy their military capacity for a long time. That's an issue of comparative justice. You know, you have a war going on, which is a dispute over a land area that Russia wants. Are they willing to drop nuclear bombs to get it? I guess hopefully that makes clear what comparative justice is. Is that too much? The probability of success. You have to make sure that the conflict is winnable, that it's not a futile conflict. So you should be able to win it. If you think you can win it, then that's part of the question. There might be legitimate conflicts, legitimate wars that nations might fight that they don't fight because they know they can't win. Think of my example before of Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland knows that it would not be able to beat the United Kingdom in a war. So they haven't declared war. You know, they could. I mean, they could say, this is part of our island. It's not yours, it's ours. It always has been. And, well, I should say always has been. It was for a long, long time before you invaded us. And we're going to take it back. Well, they're not going to do that because it would make no sense. It would violate the probability of success, even if they thought their cause was just. So that's the question, whether it's winnable. But it also the probability of success also includes the question of whether the conflict the conflict might not be so difficult to conduct that you would and to win that it would require an unequal use of arms. So I mentioned nuclear warfare before. You know, we don't want to go to nuclear war because nobody's really a winner in that. Because if we had to do it with the Russians, well, they have nuclear bombs too. Not as many as we do, but they have them. And it only takes one to cause a great amount of destruction and pain to people. So that has to be looked at in the probability as part of the probability of success. In order to succeed and win the war, would that require you to use more arms or more deadlier weapons than would be really necessary or desirable? Because once you let that genie out of the bottle, once you drop a nuke or a bunch of nukes on another country that also has them, what's to stop them from doing it out of revenge? We dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. That's because Japan didn't have any nuclear bombs. We had the hydrogen bomb and the atom bomb at the time. The Japanese didn't. So there was nothing they could respond with. But that's not the case anymore. Well, Japan still does not have nuclear weapons. But you have a small country like North Korea that has a few nuclear weapons, and that's it. That's all they need. And we're now taking note of them. We've been taking note of them for a long time now because they have nuclear weapons. We're praying that Iran won't get nuclear weapons, but it's possible. They certainly seem to be moving in that direction. Proportionality is the next condition. And I mentioned this before under comparative justice. I made a mistake there, but proportionality means that the conflict must not produce more evils or disorders than the injustice to be addressed. So basically, you're not doing more harm than good. That the injustice that you're dealing with, you're not overkilling it in order to assert your rights. You have to think of the proportion. As I mentioned before, with my border dispute example, which got a little bit muddy before I remembered, but if you're going to have to go to nuclear war over where a borderline is drawn, don't. That's just it's not worth it. And countries, this is true, this is real, because countries have realized this. The countries of India and Pakistan have a border in the northern parts of their country, which Pakistan thinks that they have this part of the territory and the border should be drawn here, like this. And India thinks that they have this part of the territory and should be drawn like that. They overlap. Each country claims it, and they have fought wars over it. They have gone to war over it. Now they haven't, because they realize proportionality. That it's not worth it especially since both of them now, India and Pakistan, have nuclear weapons themselves, that opens again that genie out of the box of what happens if, God forbid, India or Pakistan decide to drop a nuclear bomb on one of the other country just because of what's a border dispute. One group thinks the border should be this, and another thinks it should be that. Of course, land is at stake as well. They think one group thinks that this land is theirs, and the other group thinks that it's theirs. But they haven't gone to war since their last war because that situation has now developed. During the last war, which I don't want to say, it could be the 1970s, it could be the 1980s, but anyways, they're still in a state of kind of almost war. They have soldiers and weapons up there all the time in that area. But what's developed is that Pakistan and then India both got nuclear weapons. They both developed nuclear bombs. And so that has kind of raised the stakes on the proportionality. Is the border fight worth it? Would a war over the border be worth it? And so they seek to try to avoid that at all costs. And the last thing is last resort. War should always be a last resort. All other peaceful means for avoiding the conflict must have been pursued. All other peaceful alternatives to settling the conflict should be exhausted first before one goes to war. Okay, just because war is declared doesn't mean that you have to go to war. You can make peace overtures constantly to try to even avoid it, because you can always walk it back. Oops. Jus in bello. Once a war has been declared and these conditions have been met, and a country or countries do actually go to war against each other, that does not stop limitations on them. There are still limitations in how they can conduct the war, and those two are here: proportionality of means and discrimination of object. Proportionality during war, this column I made, that's a mistake. Proportionality during warfare means that the response to the aggression must not exceed the nature of the aggression. In other words, no more force may be used than is militarily necessary. I mean, if everyone's fighting with guns, then they're fighting with guns. That doesn't mean you start dropping, again, my example of nuclear bombs. You don't drop nuclear bombs. Or if you're using guns and stuff like that, you don't use chemical weapons. You don't use worse weapons, more destructive weapons than you're using. You don't try to increase the evils of warfare. Of course, that's a problem because sides usually do. You know, one side starts using chemical weapons or drops a nuclear bomb, and then what do? Well, now you feel you have the right to do the same. Well, they used sarin gas, so we can use mustard gas and kill them with chemical weapons, because they used it. But really, the response should be no. You only use the force that is militarily necessary and efficient, and not more than that. So that's proportionality of means. The means that you're using should be in accord with the situation. Discrimination of object means, well, there are objects in warfare. People should not be seen as objects, they should be seen as subjects, but you should say subjects and objects, I guess. You have subjects and you have objects. You have people and you have stuff. And in wartime, attacks must discriminate between military and non-military targets. So there should be no directly intended killing of civilians. That's never permissible. What they call the immunity of non-combatants. Non-combatants are immune from killing. So those people should not be killed. And you shouldn't also blow up buildings that are not for military use. So hospitals, churches, people's homes, stuff like that. It might be legitimate to blow up factories and whatever that are being used to produce the weapons, the arms of warfare. I mean, the problem with this, of course, is again, people, war is an evil. It's not a good thing, and it leads people to do crazy stuff, and evil stuff. And so people might use hospitals to store weapons in, or churches and stuff like that, because they know that under the rules of war and discrimination of object, they should not bomb them. They should be left alone. Well, what do you do if you know what's going on? If you know what's going on, that they're hiding weapons in these places, that's an ethical question. Scholars debate whether this theory of just war can ever be fulfilled in modern warfare, because in modern warfare, the opinion seems to be total warfare. Nothing is off limits. Everything has to be on the table, and that's what people you hear people say. You'll hear military commanders say, if a reporter asks, would you use nuclear weapons for this? Would you use chemical weapons? Nothing. We've got them. Nothing's off the table. They don't want to give their enemy a sense of, okay, they won't use nuclear weapons with us, so we can go forward. So does the theory even matter today in modern warfare? And then, of course, you have to ask the question. Then there's the issue of terrorism. Where does terrorism fit into all of this? What is the relation of terrorism? Can you use this theory of just war to also justify acts that are not warfare per se, but are warlike? I would say probably no, because it doesn't fulfill one of the central first primary conditions, which is competent authority. In many cases, I think a terrorist is taking it upon himself or herself, or that group's self, to commit an act of violence. So I would say probably not. Even if they might have a just cause, there is an injustice to be addressed or something to be defended. And their intention might be right, that they want to address that, they want to redress that injustice, but they don't have the authority themselves. Although even with you might bring in questions of like proportionality, in the case of terrorism, because, or maybe that's would be comparative justice or proportionality? I'd say, comparative justice, I think it would offend against. Because, especially with terrorism, like a person blows himself up in a crowd of people, you can't control who you're killing. So you just indiscriminately kill people who are combatants and non-combatants from your perspective. People who are harming you or performing injustice against you, in addition to people who are completely innocent who just happen to be there by circumstance. Call it fate, call it circumstance, call it whatever. They're just standing waiting for the bus that day, and someone decides he's going to blow up a bus full of people. So I think that under comparative justice, it would violate that. Terrorism would violate that, because the injustice that would be suffered, the injustice that the person is suffering, is not enough to justify what they're going to do, the injustice they're going to commit, which would be killing everybody in a group without any difference. And of course, I said discrimination, so even if you feel like you're at war with some other group, you're already at war with them, so this is an act of terrorism, which is part of your warfare. Again, you're killing a whole group of people without any difference involved. You're not just killing soldiers who are fighting you, you might just be killing women and children and men who are just there, who, whether they support your aggressor or not, is irrelevant. They're just there. They're not there to fight. They're there to catch a bus, maybe. So you can see in the case of terrorism that it becomes a different animal, and it's harder to kind of pin it down where it fits within just war theory. Then, as I've mentioned, nuclear weapons raise the ante a lot because they're just so destructive. Even if nuclear weapons even if they released all the nuclear weapons and didn't necessarily destroy the whole planet, it still would not be good for most of the planet and most of the people living on the planet. So again, what is the relevance of just war thinking when these things are there and can be used? And it has been used at least twice. Yeah. Okay. One last thing. This is from James Turner Johnson in the Westminster Dictionary of Christian Ethics. Quote, unless the use of force for the protection of values is to be utterly repudiated, meaning you say we're never use force at all, then it is necessary to have some such body of moral wisdom and cultural practice on when force is justified and what limits should circumscribe it, right around it, limit it. For Western culture and within Western Christian thought, that body of moral wisdom is just for tradition. That's what it describes. I will talk about jihad next week. So, good to see you again. Have a good weekend. See you next week. Good night, Miss Felicity. You too. Thank you, Miss Lane. Okay. Have a good night. Have a good night, ladies. You too. Have a good night. Yes, Miss Massachusetts.
I wanted to let you know, next class, would it be okay if I left a little bit early? I'm not sure how early though.
Okay, yeah, no, I understand. You'll be here and then you'll leave early?
Yeah, I'm not sure how early it is, but I also didn't want to just miss the whole class because it is the last class.
Sure. So whatever you miss, you can get the notes from somebody, or you can just watch on YouTube what I talked about, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for letting me know.